Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar co-sponsored by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and the Science History Institute. Thank you so much for joining us online this afternoon. My name is Kenny Evans and I'm a scholar in science and technology policy here at the Baker Institute. And today I'll be moderating a panel titled The President's Scientist, the Evolving Role of Science Advice to the White House. We're thrilled to be hosting a very distinguished group of panelists today, Dr. Neal Lane, Dr. Maxine Savitz, and Dr. Silas Modi, who I will introduce momentarily. They'll be discussing a new digital archive developed by the Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Program in collaboration with Rice University's Woodson Research Center. As part of this discussion, the panelists will offer their own perspectives on the history of White House science policymaking and the role of scientific advisors to the president. Let me take a quick moment to briefly introduce our archive, which we've titled the White House Scientist and Science Policy Dynamic Digital Archive. I believe we can put a link in the chat if you'd like to check it out during the event. Over the past 3 years, our team has collected archival materials related to the contributions of White House scientific advisors and senior staff, beginning with the George H.W. Bush administration through present day. In particular, the archive features the work of a group of independent scientists called the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST, as well as records from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. OSTP is led by the President's Science Advisor, who also serves as PCAST co-chair. PCAST has been around in some form since World War II, and it serves to advise the President and provide guidance on the many policy issues related to science, technology, and innovation, such as national security, international competitiveness, science education, and public health. For example, President Obama's PCAST was central in the response to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. The archive contains personal correspondence of science advisors, records of internal operations at OSTP, and preserves PCAST letters, reports, communications with the President and White House senior staff. Additionally, the archive will feature other types of materials such as pictures, videos, and a series of 18 oral history interviews with former PCAST members we've conducted in collaboration with the Science History Institute. Interviewees include two of our panelists today, Dr. Lane and Dr. Savitz, as well as a number of other leading figures in US science and technology policy, including Thomas Lovejoy, Shirley Malcolm, Norm Augustine, and Rosina Bierbaum, just to name a couple. We created the archive because in our research on White House science advising, we found it pretty challenging to get our hands on information from past PCASTs or OSTP in previous administrations. Each administration typically archives their materials separately with variable and sometimes very limited accessibility to the public. So this archive will serve as a central hub for records related to OSTP and PCAST over the past 3 decades. Additionally, the records and perspectives from PCAST members captured through our oral histories help us to understand how science policy is developed, how it can be pushed forward and implemented, as well as in some cases, how and why it isn't. These lessons can offer guidance to future science advisors and other stakeholders involved in federal science policy development. I want to highlight the word dynamic in our archive title. We've only just begun to publish items online, with much more coming soon. The archive will also collect and house records from future administrations as they're available. So be sure to check back in the coming months as things come online. Now, I'd like to, before I introduce our speakers, I want to thank a number of supporters for today's event, without whom the archive would not be possible. A grant from the National Science Foundation supports our work with the Science History Institute, including the oral histories. The archive is also supported by the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, the Center for the History of Physics at the American Institute of Physics, and Humanities Texas, which is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Humanities Texas in particular is responsible for supporting today's program. Finally, I want to thank a number of our collaborators and staff for their help with this project and the event today, including Jordan Traylor, our program archivist, Kirsten Matthews, Amanda Falk, Neal Lane, David Caruso, and Caitlin May. So now let me introduce our 3 panelists. The first is Neal Lane. He's a senior fellow in science and technology policy at the Baker Institute, and also the Malcolm Gillis University Professor Emeritus and Professor of Physics and Astronomy Emeritus at Rice. Dr. Lane served as President Bill Clinton's science advisor from 1998 to 2001, holding the titles of Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of OSTP. He was also co-chair of PCAST during that time. Prior to that position, Neal served for 5 years as the director of the National Science Foundation from 1993 to 1998. Dr. Maxine Savitz is retired general manager for technology partnerships at Honeywell, formerly Allied Signal. She's a former vice president of the National Academy of Engineering. And from 2009 to 2017, she served on Obama's PCAST as vice chair from 2011 to 2017 of PCAST. Prior to her career in industry, Dr. Savitz was employed at the U.S. Department of Energy and its predecessor agencies and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Conservation. Dr. Cyrus Modi is a professor of history, science, technology, and innovation at Maastricht University. He is the director of Maastricht's Science and Technology Studies program. And he's also a fellow at the Center for Contemporary History and Policy at the Science History Institute, a position he's held since 2007. He's a leading expert in the history of US science, especially the history of applied physical sciences. And I'll go ahead and plug, he's published a number of books on the subject, including a new book titled The Squares, US Physical and Engineering Scientists in the Long 70s, published this past July on MIT Press. We've prepared a number of questions in advance to start the conversation, but we'll also have lots of time reserved to field questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question, you can submit it through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Thank you, Neal, Maxine, and Cyrus for joining us here today. So glad you're here. So I wanted to start with Maxine. I wanted to begin with some questions related to the work on PCAST and your perspective on PCAST. Could you talk about your experience serving under President Obama, how you see PCAST's role and your role as vice chair of PCAST? Oh, Maxine, I believe you're muted, sorry.
Thanks, Ken. I also want to thank the Baker Institute for sponsoring this, and also the study you're doing. I think is very important. It's for for history to know, and I think be very useful to future PCAST members, particularly in addition to the scientific community at large. I had sent your first study, published in 2018, to the two current chairs, Francis Arnold and Maria Zuber, who found it useful. So I was very fortunate to be on President Obama's PCAST from 2009 to 2017. And as you mentioned, 2011 became vice chair. President Obama, just as Bill Clinton did in December before the inauguration, so in 2008, 2008, he named John Holdren to be the science advisor and also the head of OSTP. At the same time, he named Harold Varmus and Eric Lander to be two external co-chairs of PCAST. So the three of them were named very early before the inauguration. And then they met in January and came up with a slate of 18 other people. And I've told that they were all, there were no changes made. So it was really, up to the President Obama really wanted to get science on the right foot and was really like science, loved science fairs. I mean, he was just really excited and interested in facts. So John called many of us in February to ask if we would serve, and the 18 of us, of course, did say yes. In April of 2009, we were inducted into PCAST at the National Academy of Sciences annual meeting, and it occurred in the Academy's building under the picture of Lincoln creating the National Academy of Science. So a lot of history. That was our first interaction with the president, and we had the opportunity over the 8 years to meet with him over a dozen times. So actually then Vice President Biden met with us 3 times. And the agenda was, as you mentioned, an H1N1 study was actually initiated in June and finished by August, which was our first real formal meeting. And we approved it, and we actually had a meeting with the president to present it. At our first meeting, we sort of helped develop what did we want to study and how did we go proceed. And much of the input that studies throughout the whole 8 years came from discussions with the president and vice president. Cabinet members would come and other administration, and we would look for things that were not covered. So, and in the course of, John had told me, well, it meets 6 times a year in Washington, 2 days a week, won't be, that much time. Fortunately, I was retired because we did 39 studies in the 8 years. And you're not on every study, and you're able to bring in experts for your working groups, but they were, co-led. And we met as a whole 44 times and then published these 39 reports, which I assume will ultimately be in your archives if they're not there ready, covering a wide range of topics. And PCAST typically covers areas in science and technology that are everything except really defense and security related. The Defense Science Board, defense policy cover this. But we had people on PCAST who were very familiar with the defense programs, and we would, periodically there would be interactions between the two of them. I don't know how long you want me to go on this, but I'll just say a couple things that when Harold Varmus became head of the National Cancer Institute in 2011, he couldn't remain on PCAST because you can't have a presidential appointment and also be an advisor in a different way. And so Bill Press and I were made the vice chairs. And as part of that, with John and Eric Lander, we're a team that we are on the phone every week with staff, looking at what their agenda, looking at the status of reports, seeing where things we should be doing and not be doing. John was very careful about making sure he didn't compete with the academies themselves in the types of studies that he did, and so that they were very clear to be very actionable items and very policy oriented. And we met 6 times a year. We met met on Thursday all day, and at dinner we would have invited cabinet members or high-level administration people. And the Friday mornings was an open session streamed, and Friday lunch, and so it was a wonderful group to work with. And of the 21 of us who were there originally, 15 were there all 8 years, and they were replaced by additionally equally, wonderful scientists and engineers, and it really worked as a very collegial group. But everybody still had their independence and their thinking. But it was, a very positive experience for all of us, and think our reports did be used. I mean, so it wasn't just sitting on a desk that, and you really want something to say that has some sort of impact, and impacts are continuing to occur to our surprise, which is nice.
Yeah, thank you. I want to stick with you for a second and follow up on that. There's, in your oral history, you had mentioned a really interesting report. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it on hearing aids that I understand had a clear impact.
So one of the items that the president asked us to look at in one of, and when we met with the president, we would have dialogue about what should our studies be. And if we didn't meet with the president, John met with the president and staff, and so it was constant interaction. But they had asked us to look at people aging, and how do you keep, what technologies are available for people to age in place and to remain, vibrant and community as we're getting older and older. We started looking at it, and hearing became a major component of that. And we decided, instead of waiting to do the full report, we would just deal with hearing aids as a separate letter report, so it could be out faster than the regular report. And it, I think, came out in October 2014 or 15. And the incredible thing that impressed all of us, including the president, was hearing aids were costing 10 times as much as an iPad. And you put it in that perspective, and people paying $5,000 for hearing aids. Over half the people over 80 have hearing issues, and it really makes people, and people start having at earlier ages, you get isolated, not social. So what can you do? And one of the things we were, and Medicare, when it was formed in 1965, did not allow funding for hearing aids or for actual audiologists. What we recommended, one of the recommendations that the FDA change regulations so that hearing aids could be purchased over the counter, and also that you didn't need necessarily an audiologist prescription. It could be done like you buy eyeglasses. Now, people with severe hearing disabilities needed to really see physicians to make care, but this was, such a general part of the population. So that was really one of the key recommendations from that. And it also, we thought it would lead to a lot of technology development if you lowered the price. And the VA was paying $500 for a pair of aids for hearing aids at the time, because they could negotiate the price. So it was, anyhow, the report was sent, as many were sent to Congress, and Elizabeth Warren was interested in the subject, and she and Senator Grassley actually issued a bipartisan bill that said the regulation should be issued and hearing should happen. And the bill passed in 2017. So it was 2 years after our report, but it takes time. And by the time the administration had changed, they were supposed to put out within 3 years finalized rules. Well, nothing happened during the administration. So when Biden became president, he issued an executive order, and that the FDA should have rules out. They put rules out about a year ago, and then in August they became final, and they start to be implemented in October. So people can now go to their Costco or to there'll be other drugstores and all to get these without going to an audiologist first. And it just showed a nice trail that how something got evolved and really got input from the president, how it then got congressional people took an action, and that required dialogue between Eric and John with the congressional people. And now we hope the price and capability of hearing aids become better and better.
Yeah, thanks, Maxine. It's a good story.
Yeah, yeah.
Neal, I want to turn to you and get your perspectives. When you were science advisor, how did you approach chairing PCAST, and how did you view PCAST and interact with it?
Well, I joined the White House very late in the administration. I'd been at NSF for 5 years, as you point out. So when President Clinton asked me to come over to succeed to follow Jack Gibbons, who'd been his science advisor for all the first term and half of the second term, there were just 2.5 years left in the administration. So I didn't come over with a plan, if you like, or without a really much knowledge about what PCAST was doing. As NSF director, I had no interaction with PCAST, but of course I would see the reports coming out and read many of them, and PCAST had been quite active in the first term. But in terms of number scale, I think in those days, it was nothing like what Maxine has described. I think there was a significant upgrading in budget and certainly in numbers and level of activity with President Obama, reflecting many things, certainly his personal interest in science. President Clinton was very interested in science, but he had a busy agenda. We were late in the second term, and so the timing was certainly very different when I arrived in the White House than perhaps it would have been had I come in at the very beginning. PCAST in Clinton's day was quite diverse, issued a number of reports, studies, and especially in areas of energy. And John Holdren, in fact, who was on PCAST during the Clinton administration, was very active in leading many of these studies. And there was a strong collaboration with Rosina Beerbaum, for example, who was on the OSTP staff as Associate Director for Environment. So there were good relations, I think, involving staff and PCAST, but we were very small. OSTP was 60, 65 people during those days. The budget was such that there was inadequate support for PCAST. I mean, I think there's no question, it was clear to us. It was not the funding to get out more reports. There was not the funding or the staffing to support PCAST adequately. Just reflecting on history, I think, because I think our size during the Clinton administration, probably not so different from Alan Bromley's staff during George Herbert Walker Bush 41 administration, sort of the order 60, 65 folks. And PCAST was, I don't know, maybe in an evolutionary stage through that period, and then blossomed, I believe. And not in terms of, I'm not suggesting that its membership was not excellent in the past, but the scale of activity was certainly very different. And so, I moved over knowing very little about OSTP or PCAST. So much of my time was on this steep learning curve, and no longer focused just on what NSF did, but on all of the issues of science technology that PCAST dealt with. And so I didn't come over with the idea of some new projects, but rather making sure we got finished what had already started. That included some studies in energy and even a project focused on international cooperation in renewable energy. And of course, climate change being the context in which that was done. We issued some reports on biodiversity and a number of others. But I would say the only new thing that came up that comes to mind probably was the nanotechnology initiative that was part of PCAST activity, and that was new in the time that I was there. But it was a great experience, but it was probably, I was still on that learning curve when the administration ended in January 2001.
Thanks, Neal. I wanted to quickly follow up and ask, you mentioned energy, you mentioned climate. Is there anything that you think PCAST is uniquely positioned, any policy subject is uniquely positioned to address, rather than, say, the National Cat or other policy advisory bodies?
Well, I think PCAST in the Biden administration, for a variety of reasons, really didn't get going as rapidly as I think it did in the Obama administration. That's just my impression. Maxine can certainly correct me if I'm wrong about that. But they did issue a report on the semiconductor, providing advice on the implementation of the CHIPS and Science Act that was passed. So they've been active, and the new science advisor, Arti Prabhakar, whom I worked with in the Clinton administration when she was NIST director, I think it's an outstanding appointment, and is picking up the reins very fast, and I'm sure working closely with PCAST and what they're going to do. It is a little bit of a unique time now for OSTP and PCAST, because the president's agenda involving science and technology and its role in these major issues, competitiveness, manufacturing, climate change, biotechnology, other key technologies, competitiveness, economy, is, well, let me just say large. It's a bold agenda, it's a large agenda, and it was laid out quite crisply, I guess, in the president's memorandum to his first science advisor. So there's a lot of work to do. I think Arti Prabhakar is just the right person to take it all on, and my sense is things are moving rather rapidly right now. So in terms of uniqueness of PCAST to do these things, PCAST has outstanding individuals on board. They'll take their lead from the president, as the body has always done, and I think with Artie on board, it'll be quite successful and very active.
Thanks, Neal. I think we'll return to that a bit later. I wanted to turn to Cyrus to talk about a little bit about our archive, as your kind of perspective as not just a historian of science, but also a historian of science policy. Could you talk a bit about how you use archival material, oral histories in your research?
Yeah, sure. Let me just first echo Maxine by thanking you, Kenny, for inviting us to this, and also thank you for all the great work that's gone into this archive. I've worked for both Rice and for Science History Institute, and I'm partnered with both organizations on another project, so it's great to see those two organizations work so well together. It's a great combination. Why am I excited about this archive? What use can academic historians make of it? So one of the big things that historians of science are always trying to show is the potential for things to have turned out differently in the past, right? We're really interested in showing that choices were made in the past that led things to go in one direction or another, right? And to show, who helped shape those choices, who had less input to those choices, or who was excluded, and also to remind us today that we can choose for things to be otherwise. So for that kind of question, the sorts of archival materials you've gathered, the sorts of oral histories that you're doing, that's really indispensable. Right? If you just have access to the published record, there often everything looks as though it could not have been otherwise. Right? Historical actors, I think, especially people who make policy, maybe especially people who make policy that's related to science, often want it to seem as though their choices were inarguably the best choices, or even that they weren't making any choices at all. Right? Certainly the past 2.5 years, we've heard a lot of talk about just following the science, as though that's not a choice. But when you have access to the unpublished record, then you can see that, in fact, choices were made, right? People are debating which policies to adopt. They're often much more hesitant or ambivalent in those unpublished records than they are in the published record. Often they're basing their choices on contextual factors that aren't at all apparent in the published sources. So you really need to be able to go to these kind of archival documents in order to get at that. That's not to say that unpublished sources are somehow more real than published ones, or that people aren't being truthful in published documents. It's just that unpublished documents represent how people conduct their business in front of a very different kind of audience than they do in front of the public eye. And similarly, oral histories are a really powerful way of getting at things that don't ever make their way onto paper, either in the published or the unpublished record, right? So, you can ask someone, how effective was that Neal Lane guy at chairing meetings, right? Those kinds of questions that probably aren't going to get onto paper. Of course, you always also have to remember that interviewees today know how things turned out, and also that they're involved in debates in the present, and that both of those things inform how they remember and represent the past. So what you really want in the end, I think this is really nicely done in the archive, is that you have to triangulate all of those different sources, right? You have to triangulate what's said in public, what's said in private at the time, and also what people say when they reconstruct their memories for oral history interviews.
Yeah, thanks, Cyrus. I want to stick with you for a sec. So speaking of history, I know, in policy circles, science policy, people often talk about the golden age of scientific advice, where scientists were very close to the center of power. at least in the published record, in the White House versus today. Could you talk a bit about what you see the state of science advising with respect to, say, the past early Cold War?
Yeah, so maybe first thing to say is I think we should be pretty cautious about phrases like golden age. Alan said, for instance, that the Dutch golden age was a term that was used for a long time, but now thankfully it's starting to fall out of favor because people are a little more cognizant of the exploitative practices that golden age was built on. Golden age of science advising is, it's a more benign concept for sure. But even so, we should remember it wasn't golden for everyone. Even if it had some features that we would envy today, it was made possible by conditions that don't really exist even anymore. And also, even for the insiders for whom it was a golden age, it had its ups and downs, right? So someone like Vannevar Bush, who was really close to FDR during World War II, they were good personal friends, despite very different politics, and who used that influence to totally reshape American science during the war. Even Bush, after the war, was somewhat unceremoniously kicked out of the center of power. So, it's definitely, its goldenness came and went, right? And even in that period, there were insiders and outsiders, right? The science advisors during that golden age, they were a relatively homogeneous group compared to today, right? In terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and discipline also, right? And their advice was informed by a pretty specific understanding of who should count as a scientist and which scientists' opinions should count. I mean, that said, we should give the science advisors of that day a lot of credit, for instance, for defending Rachel Carson's ideas from, frankly, misogynistic and misinformed attacks, particularly from the chemical industry. But, we also have to be mindful of the context they were in, right? There was a more stable political center back then, right? The US was a polarized society back then, for sure. It had plenty of rifts that we can see echoing even today. But if you compare, say Eisenhower and JFK, between them there was this pretty large common ground where science advisors seem to have felt free to give pretty frank advice. That science advice wasn't apolitical, of course, right? The choice to maintain this large center was a political choice. It was a choice that did political work for politicians like Eisenhower and JFK. The historian Zoya Wong has shown, it's a choice that became more and more and more difficult, such that from LBJ onward, presidents really couldn't make that choice as often, right? That they felt that they had to ignore or control or contradict science advice when it was politically necessary for them. That said, we also shouldn't slip into a kind of declensionist narrative that there was a golden age and that we're not in that golden age anymore. Science advice has ups and downs. I think you can see this a little bit in what Neal was talking about. Certainly, with respect to the kind of political polarization of science, there have been plenty of periods since that golden age when there has been bipartisan consensus, on at least some aspects of science policy. So the National Nanotechnology Initiative, for instance, was authorized by a pretty substantial bipartisan majority, and it was an initiative that carried smoothly, I think, but I'd be very interested to hear from the others, between the Clinton and Bush administrations. So, we shouldn't look back to that past as a lost era that we can never attain again. It had plenty of bad that's still with us. It had some features that we treasure more that are also still with us.
Yeah, thanks, Cyrus. Really insightful response. Thank you. I wanted to follow with Maxine and see. I know, Maxine, you were involved in, and I think either chaired or co-chaired a number of PCAST studies on nano. Could you talk about how, in the years that you served on PCAST, how you viewed the National Nanotechnology Initiative and how it maybe changed during that period?
Okay, but I want to just add a couple comments to about the golden age, and also Neal's, thinking that I think I agree. I think Artie will really, it'll really accelerate their thing. And President Biden, as I mentioned, did come to several of our PCAST meetings. The first one he came to actually was right after the 2010 election, and that was sort of not a happy time, but we were presenting an energy report that Ernie Moniz and I co-chaired and talked about increasing R&D, and he hoped that that might be a talking point that maybe both sides could agree on. But he was very involved, and he actually came to one of our dinners. So I mean, I think he will be, he understands PCAST and knows the mode, and he made the science advisor and head of OST a cabinet member as an official. So it does get to be sit at the table. John Holdren was an unofficial cabinet member. He did participate in cabinet meetings, and there was a green cabinet that was the environmental groups that he was part of. So it does depend upon the president so much as to how it's going to be used. And I think, I'm expecting a lot of very good reports and important contributions. It's interesting on the nano, and Neal also mentioned it in addition to Cyrus. This was set up by Clinton in the end of his, and probably Neal, you had input to all of this in 2000, and it was announced 2000 a speech at Caltech. And if you go to the Clinton Library, you can actually see the actual speech with his handwritten comments on it. And at that point, had the vision that there should be material that was 10 times stronger than steel and much lighter in weight, that the whole Library of Congress documents could fit on the size of a sugar cube, and would be also drug delivery. And started with, in 2001 with 5 agencies and a $500 million. In 2003, the Congress codified the nanotechnology R&D initiative or law. And as part of it, it said there should be a management group who reviews sort of the overall strategy and management. And then the academy should do every 3 or 4 years a technical review. So there were the two groups. And by executive order, actually, I think Bush had the PCAST be the ones to oversee the nanotechnology program. And so every 2 years, PCAST had to issue a report. And when Obama took office in 2009, it was time for the third assessment. And Ed Penhote and I were asked to chair the study. And that was actually the second study that PCAST did. So we were sort of wondering how, and it started with interesting how, just from a process point of view, we had as an expert Chad Merkin, one of the top nanotechnology people in the country, still was on PCAST, but the 3 co-chairs felt, he could be on the committee, but it should be chaired by people who were more independent of the actual, what was being done by the federal government and others. And we put together an expert committee, and it had small industry, big industry, a lot of academic people and others to form this study. The legislation that passed in 2003 also had 7 items that the committee was supposed to address. And so certain things, in addition to establishing goals. And so by that time, so the 2010, when it was issued in March, was the 10th anniversary of the Nano Initiative. And by that time, there were 25 agencies involved. And so it was clearly an example of a technology where the government could catalyze activity, and it was over $1 billion budget per year. And OSTP had a coordinating office, and there were major program elements in it. A thing that also we found in looking at the work that for the first time, there was major competition for the nanotechnology, if R&D and what was happening if you looked at patents and looked at citations. And China, for the first time in 2009, was issued more patents than the US for nano initiatives. And if you took the whole UK together, they had separated out Germany and Britain, and you would have also have had major efforts. So it was really important from a U.S. competitiveness and U.S. Strength, and there was also a lot of progress being made in it. And so we really, one of the major recommendations out of this study was there should continue to have funding for the research, but start to look at manufacturing research so that things would start to move from research to commercialization. Another thing was it was felt that it was an opportunity for the Office of OSTP and their coordinating Office of the Science NSTC to really pick a coordinator who was going to be very proactive and react. There were also activities going on in states. I mean, IBM was going to put in New York State a major nano manufacturing facility. And so lots of opportunity, very exciting technologies. What had not been focused on very much at all by the past two assessments or in the work was the environmental concerns. And here you're dealing with very small particles and you're worried about asbestos. And so it was thought that should, be really enhanced. And one of the things that recommended that's never occurred that was not necessarily nano related was the fact that there should be a program to retain PhDs from foreign countries to give them green cards when they got their PhD in science. And that's many people have recommended. That didn't happen. There was in March of 2010, when the report was finished, we had a meeting with the president, and here we're still in the financial crisis and addressing it, but he came to the meeting on time and we presented our results to him and also brought samples. I mean, I figured you don't give a talk about materials, and which were, I mean, was you could tell his BlackBerry had nano materials, but showed some real things, including some made by a small company, a photovoltaic ability. You rolled up plastic and put it on a tent or something military that would take sunlight and create it to electricity. But he was, he really was interested in, and asked questions. It was our second substantive briefing. And in 2012, we had a second one, and things were moving more and more towards commercialization. And for that one, we again said, focus on manufacturing, but still make sure you keep the basic research has to keep going. And NSF started at the beginning of the program and to this day still continues with the major nano program, as do other agencies. So in 2012, we sort of, looked back to see what had been done, and the funding had continued. And as part of looking at, and again, putting expert group together, we had some people from the first committee still on the second, that should be some signature initiatives to really highlight certain areas. One in energy, one in medicine, and one in electronic computers. And those were the main. Then by 2014, every 2 years was really, and we briefed the Congress on this regularly too, since they had started it. Every 2 years was a lot of time to, things didn't move that quickly, and the Academy had to do it every 3 years. Was there some way of, but that didn't change right away. 2014, there was the fifth assessment led by Michael McQuaid, who was at the time Chief Technology Officer at United Technology, and Mark Gornberg, who was a venture capitalist. And they reviewed, the part of the issues were that the funding that we had recommended in 2012 hadn't occurred by 2014, and the signature initiatives had gotten less, but they've suggested maybe a grand challenge might be. I think grand challenges had been working out well in others. And 2016, right, the last report we issued was sort of a letter report that both Michael and Mark co-chaired about the importance of this and continuing it. And it actually did continue on the funding. I don't know that they did any assessments during that time, but the program has continued. And in this past October, the Biden administration issued, 2021, issued a national strategic plan for nanotechnology, and starting some, talking about all the accomplishments in consumer electronics infrastructure, drug delivery systems, and put out a strategic plan as to what the goals are very similar to what was set out in 2000. I mean, they've expanded, but building infrastructure, continuing with research, and so it's sort of exciting to see it evolve. One could ultimately say, when do you stop? And it will continue, but I think it's very important to continue, and partly for competitiveness and pushing the science. And it leads, you have new initiatives that have kind of put their history on it. The quantum initiative is one that can very much relate. So it was, it's been interesting to see such the continuation of something like that started under Neal and is still very vibrant and has, a major, I don't know the numbers in the private sector of sales at this point, but it just really has helped the economy.
Thanks, Maxine. I think I remember Neal having a bit of a hand in the National Nanotechnology Initiative. Neal, could you talk a bit how you got President Clinton interested in nano and in research science?
Well, Bill Clinton's interested in everything, so that's a place to start, I think. But he liked this initiative when it finally got to him. He used to call it my tiny little initiative. Thought that was funny. It was actually funny, and I think I said something like, "Well, Mr. President, it's tiny, but it's going to cost $500 million." There were some key people involved here. Mike Rocco at NSF was sort of a leader among program officers around these agencies. Tom Khalil, who was in the White House in Gene Sperling's time at the National Economic Council, he was already interested in this by the time I got to the White House. And then there were people on the OSTP staff, Duncan Moore and others who were already primed. So when I got to the White House, when I left NSF, I had one final hearing, and I was asked, Dr. Lane, if you can pick out an area of science and engineering you think is going to make great strides forward or so forth in the next decade or so, what should it be? Well, I should have said, like Hawking, I don't know. It's impossible to predict where there would be major breakthroughs. But for some reason, I said nanoscale science and engineering is an area that I thought had tremendous progress. So PCAST got very interested in this. Chuck Vest was asked to form an expert group, the kind that Maxine talked about, and delivered a recommendation to PCAST, and then PCAST joined me in recommending to the president. And that one quick anecdote, Maxine mentioned the Caltech speech. When we'd been working with a speechwriter for a long time, and I kept trying to get something in and it keep getting cut out. So it turns out on Air Force One, just as the president and the rest of us were leaving the plane, the president said, "Neal, what do you think of the speech?" I said, "It's a wonderful speech, Mr. President." And then he said, "Is there anything that I should say that's not in here?" And I said, "Well, you might want to say the following." And he said, "Where could I put it?" And I said something like, page 3, paragraph 2, and he scribbled it in. So I guess it's in there someplace, but that's the way he worked on the fly. He seriously, and the people around him thought this was an important initiative. Presidential initiatives often don't last all that long. I just been astonished. And I think it had continuity into the G.W. Bush administration because it was bipartisan, had industrial support, and Norm Augustine on Clinton's PCAST and Chuck Vest on Clinton's PCAST also served 8 years with the G.W. Bush PCAST. So there was continuity there. And then continuing the work that Maxine has done and all the people who worked on these reviews, carrying out quality reviews. There's no substitute for that. Just serious review and recommendations and critiques. That's what allows things to be successful.
Thanks, Neal. We've got a good question from the audience that I'll open to all three of you. And that is, where does scientific integrity fall in into this process of policy development? They ask, what systems in place, policies work well for ensuring scientific integrity in White House policy development?
Well, I can start by just quickly saying, of course, it ought to be number one when we're considering anything about science, whether it's R&D or policy. But it isn't always because of timing or what occurs, what the drivers are. Cyrus was very clear in saying that a lot of things are politically driven. And so what you have to do in that situation is just make sure when you're putting a policy together, a white paper, an executive order, a presidential, a bill, whatever, that you have thought about the implications for science integrity. And of course, science integrity is a very broad term. So it goes all the way from the behavior of scientists in laboratories and in government to ensuring that whatever the policy is really going to underscore the importance of continued scientific integrity, openness, transparency, sharing with the public the implications plus or minus of various scientific endeavors. I'm not aware there's serious structures that I could point to that are in place to assure scientific integrity gets the attention that it needs. But then I've been away from it for a long time. Maxine may be closer to how these issues have been handled in later administrations.
Yeah, what John Holdren did was issue some sort of letter or memo to each of the major agencies for them to sign up to some principles of science integrity and to incorporate them, and did follow through to make sure that that was happening, and that's, as far as I know, the only sort of formal thing that I've seen recently, and he was, that was a very important thing, and it was very important to him, and to that happened.
And let me just
something for your archives to get, if you can get.
Let me add, Maxine, that I think John was also effective with a number of others in trying to get serious attention to science integrity issues that had come along prior to the Obama administration,
right,
during the previous administration, and a number of us wrote a statement with that regard. The Union of Concerned Scientists was very worried about things that were going on. They weren't necessarily attributable to the president, Bush, or to his science advisor, Jack Marburger, at all. They were just things that were happening that shouldn't be happening in government. And John and others certainly were leaders in speaking out about that issue.
Yeah, just to give my 2 cents, since this is one of the things I'm working on now. We have to be very mindful of the different kinds of integrity that we demand from scientists, and also the tensions between some of those different kinds of integrity, right? So, we want scientists to contribute to society. In the US, that's often we want them to seek ways to translate their work to the market. But yeah, that can often incentivize, fudging data or problematic relationships with industry that may not look like they have a lot of integrity, right? Even though we see it as part of the scientist's integrity to engage with society. Similarly, we want scientists to show that they're spending public money wisely, and so we demand of them that they produce lots of output, but that can incentivize people turning to paper mills and committing plagiarism and other ways to boost that output. So I'm all for scientific integrity, but it's an incredibly complex issue. It has these inherent tensions in it. I also think it's something that always should be looked at, both from an individual level, but also from a systemic level, and that we should never demand more of the individual than we do from the system itself. That if there are incentives that are coming down from the system that encourage bad behavior amongst individuals, the problem is with the system and not just with the individuals.
Thanks, Cyrus. I've kind of got one final open question. All three of you have kind of touched on about today's moment, how the challenges we're facing kind of both the US and the world in terms of science and science's role. And I wanted to wrap up with kind of get Neal's perspective, Maxine's perspective, Cyrus's perspective on this moment in time and the challenges that Dr. Prabhakar is facing as she takes on the helm of science advisor at OSTP.
Well, I'll start, be very brief. I mean, I think several of us have written on the subject, for example, of China, the rapid rise of China and implications for US global competitiveness and geopolitical influence in the world. But science, technology, a key part of that. And that, I think, was a major driver of the Endless Frontier Act that Majority Leader Schumer and Senator Young put forward, and that led to eventually to other legislation, including chips and science. So China's not going to go away, but at the same as a competitor, but at the same time, these big issues, climate change, pandemics, and security of various kinds, we're not going to be able to cope with those without some kind of cooperative relationship at some level of cooperation and understanding with China and other nations. So that's a real challenge ahead. And science is often a place where diplomacy can stem from, a place where scientists are used to working across international lines. Tension's high right now. Got a lot of examples where the system, Cyrus, the governments are in the way, politics is in the way, but these major issues facing all nations not going to go away. They're going to require advanced science technology. They're going to need cooperation at the same time. All nations want to be in a position where they can compete economically.
Okay, I'll follow up. I fully agree with everything that Neal said. I'll come back to home. I think in the energy area, I mean, it's amazing the legislation for clean energy that has passed, and it's trying to, DOE has $100 billion of money that has to be implemented related to clean energy from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, and hopefully that will continue and do well. But there's still major issues that come, particularly as we see these that science and technology really has to deal with is the severe weather, and where you get your hurricanes and you have droughts and communities wiped out, and how do you rebuild? And I just, I see that's an area where, we looked at something as cities of the future, but it was not looking at rebuilding. It was the electrification and all which is occurring. And so I think that's going to be with us, and important to look at the nexus of water, food, and energy. And there's limitations on each, and there's not a cabinet group that looks at that. But what are the scientific and technology approaches to it? And the third will just the pandemics, just being ready for the next one. They're arguing still now about refilling the stockpile. So I mean, I think that that becomes now a global of activity. It is not just U.S. just because of how it has changed, as we saw with COVID, how much how we address these things, that particularly on a all of these on a global stance. So it's an exciting time for science and challenging.
Yeah, I mean, international competition and diplomacy and global entanglements have been big drivers in American science policy for a very, very long time. For a few decades, clearly the competition with the Soviet Union totally remade American science, right? If you look at the size of the American scientific enterprise before World War II, and then what it became during the Cold War, especially after Sputnik, the increase in quantitative numbers is totally staggering, and qualitatively that had all kinds of effects. Some good, many bad, right? I mean, I think there were many positives about that effort. But on the other hand, there were many things that we should regret. Even if you think that it just is purely in terms of the effects of above ground nuclear testing, tens of thousands of lives adversely affected, right? I think anyway that from the period of détente onward, from the thaw in the Cold War in the early 70s onward, there were some more positive initiatives in American science. People took the time to say, well, okay, we can worry less about this competition with the Soviet Union and do something different. Unfortunately, then, economic competition kind of took over that niche, and you see, especially in the 70s and 80s, that the competition with Japan really supercharged certain reforms in American science. Again, some of that was for the good. Much of it was driven by rhetoric that looks pretty ugly today. I would say it's a good thing that sort of calmer heads prevailed, and that from the early 90s onward, we moved more towards the kinds of cooperation and diplomacy that Neal's talking about with China today. So we have a long history of doing this, of global entanglements, kind of shaping how we think American science should work. We have some failures that we can learn from. We also have plenty of successes, I think, that can guide us going forward.
Thanks, Cyrus. And thank you, Maxine, and thank you, Neal. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out and hopefully get it answered. But I want to end by thanking our three panelists again today for joining us for this webinar, and for the audience for asking such good questions. So thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.